Hi everyone, happy Monday. So today I want to talk about something that I don't say recently, but learned about only in the last year or so. And that is space dyslexia. And there is a really interesting connection between space dyslexia, or the cause of space dyslexia, and reading disorders and reading difficulties and so forth. So if you have a child who struggles with reading, it's not necessarily dyslexia, because as I've talked about before, there's many reasons why somebody can have a reading difficulty, and it's not just that it's a phonemic deficit or auditory processing. But if they have difficulties with letter reversals, slow decoding, poor reading comprehension, or even stuff like dysgraphia, then this live is for you. So the big thing to keep in mind, as I always say, is that so many of us spend so much of our time trying to, or believing that it takes years or months to, improve reading and behavioral or learning difficulties, and that it's this grueling uphill battle. And I absolutely do not believe that is true, because of what I've read, because of what I've learned, and because of what I see every day. So once you address the root cause and start working on brain development, it's suddenly not as important or necessary to find all of these other learning strategies and discovering what type of learner they are and finding the perfect tutor. And I'm not bashing any of those things. All of those things are immensely helpful. But if they are slow, it's continuously remaining a very slow process, then to me, we need to dig deeper. So, space dyslexia, let me talk about that first. Space dyslexia is when astronauts go to space, and their body and their system is no longer adapted to gravity. And so when they come back to Earth, their body has to readapt to gravity. And that has to do with their vestibular and proprioceptive systems. And what's really interesting is a lot of them come back and develop something called space dyslexia, where they may have never had a reading difficulty in the past, and all of a sudden they have a reading difficulty or reading disorder, and they are now reading or experiencing the same difficulties that children with reading disorders have. What's really interesting is that this isn't something that's permanent for them. NASA is very aware of this phenomena and has many tools in place to help these astronauts overcome their space dyslexia. And a lot of the strategies or tools or exercises that these astronauts do in order to improve the space dyslexia is stuff that we do as educational therapists, OTs, people who understand getting to the root cause. And that starts with improving the vestibular system and the proprioceptive system, that motor development that I've talked about in the last few weeks. If we talk about that learning pyramid, we really want to improve the motor and vestibular system, which is on the bottom of that pyramid, right? So the thing is that when kids have visual processing difficulties, like letter reversals, blurring, not being able to keep their eye on the target, and they keep skipping lines or skipping letters and all of that type of stuff, and they have to follow with their finger. And we have all these tricks. And we also tell them to take a ruler or a lined piece of paper so that they don't lose their place as they're going down the page. And all of those are excellent strategies. But wouldn't it be amazing if our kids didn't have to have those, even rely on those strategies, and they didn't have those things to even slow them down because they were able to overcome it completely? So, I know I see kids using colored overlays, graphic organizers to improve their reading comprehension. But again, what is slowing them down? And what is slowing them down is that we are not addressing the root cause, and the root cause is poor vestibular function. In this particular case. So I want to be clear, I'm not saying that all reading disorders is poor vestibular function, but oftentimes when there is issues with eye tracking, saccadic eye movements, losing their place, letter reversals, or just laborious reading, parents will often say to me, oh no, my child doesn't have, a reading disorder because they can read the words, they just don't know what they read. that is a reading disorder, because reading is not just decoding. Reading is decoding in order to be able to understand the meaning of a text. Otherwise, reading has no purpose. So the big thing is that the vestibular system, as I've talked about in recent weeks, one function is balance, right? And a big function of that we don't think of, it's not just falling over. If you've ever had vertigo, we know how awful that can be. But it's also very important for eye stability, for our eye to be able to remain on a target. So not losing our place, not jumping over a letter in a word, being able to track smoothly so that we're not using so much of our mental focus to be able to do that. So then our mind is now free to be able to understand the text. So I often compare it to learning to drive a car, right? I remember when I learned to drive, I had to use all of my mental energy to navigate this vehicle and navigate the roads, right? I didn't want the radio on or people talking and all of that type of stuff, because I needed all of my mental energy just to focus on what I'm doing. Now, I can multitask when I drive, and no, don't worry, I'm not doing any serious dangerous driving, but I can have the radio on, I can play with okay, I want to change the station, I can chat with someone and so forth without losing the ability to manage my vehicle. These kids, when they are reading, often when they have visual processing issues or poor vestibular function, they are reading on manual. They are not reading on automatic. So one example of a kid that I worked with many years ago, he was 13 and really struggled with reading. He couldn't read more than 10 words. He had a lot of letter reversals, skipping, poor decoding, poor comprehension, all of that type of stuff. And he didn't know that this was abnormal, what he was experiencing, because that's all he knew. He didn't realize he had poor vestibular function. He did have poor balance and coordination, but he didn't understand, neither did his mom, that was impacting his reading until we started addressing that. And all of a sudden, his letter reversals improved, his reading became smoother, more fluent, and he was more able to understand the text. So just keep that in mind, and just keep in mind that we have to address the most basic part of that learning pyramid, right? The auditory and visual have to be supported by a strong motor and vestibular system. So what happens is that we understand vestibular function very often as, oh yeah, that's your sense of balance, which is true. But in order for all of that to happen, we need the engagement of the senses, the visual, the auditory, the tactile, and also the proprioceptive system, which is comprised of the muscles and joints, which often get thrown off for astronauts, which is why they often will develop space dyslexia, which help to maintain that balance. So this really should come as no surprise if you have a child with dyslexia or a reading difficulty, because I'm willing to bet a lot of you have kids with more than one diagnosis, or maybe they don't have a diagnosis, but they have reading difficulties and they're very sensitive with what they have with their clothing. And that ties back into vestibular and proprioception. Or they just have general sensory processing issues. Maybe they're sensory seeking. So or maybe they are dysgraphic, or they have dyspraxia. All of this ties back to an underdeveloped motor and vestibular system. So basically the vestibular system sends information to the nervous system, to the eyes, which regulates the movement of the eye. So you can see why that vestibular portion is so absolutely important. And so one of the things that also happens is that these kids often will have poor hand-eye coordination, which as I move up further up that learning pyramid with my clients, that is something we work on as well. Obviously, we want to make sure the motor and vestibular system is good, but hand-eye coordination is absolutely a part of my programs whenever I work with these clients, because it's research has found it's so much a part of the underlying factor with dyslexia, dysgraphia, and dyspraxia, among other things. And a lot of this, again, shouldn't come as a surprise, because parents will tell me, he has dyslexia and he never could ride a bike, or he had a really hard time learning to ride a bike, or he has poor coordination, or his handwriting is really sloppy, right? All of those things can be clues, but don't let them be hard and fast rules, because I do have clients where they have dyslexia, they're really good at sports, but they have really terrible handwriting. So parents will sometimes say, oh no, his motor development is fine because he loves sports and he's great at them. So there's all these fine details of how there's compensations or areas of overdevelopment in the brain, meaning that's why some of these kids have like excel in certain areas, but then there's deficiencies in other areas of the brain. When I say deficiencies, I'm not talking nutrition. I'm talking like something is underdeveloped in a certain area of their brain. So if you want to kind of put this in real time of what this feels like for these kids is, imagine you're reading on a ride. Like you're on some kind of ride where you're being bumped around and your balance is being thrown off. Or if you've ever had vertigo or something going on where your balance was poor and then you're trying to read and write. And I've had that when I was really ill a few years ago and it was awful. And I had to go to work and my balance was so compromised and trying to read was insane. And I don't want to say it was the same as having space dyslexia, but it definitely put things in perspective of what it's like for a lot of these kids. So keep in mind, cerebellum in our brain, it is responsible for movement and learning. And isn't that interesting that in the cerebellum, the part of the brain where both learning and movement take place, and no wonder movement is the precursor to good learning, right? I've talked about that before. So what happens is it's connected, the cerebellum is connected with the vestibular system, and this is what activates what is known as the postural muscles, like the core muscles. So if your child has a weak core, and this is another clue that something needs to be addressed, they're going to have more difficulty at focusing their eyes on a target, because when the core muscles are weak or underdeveloped, every other muscle in the body will be weak and might have issues with coordination, including the eye muscles. So this can look like, words on a page moving, letter reversals, difficulty copying information from the board into their notebook, poor coordination with sports, as I've mentioned, eye tracking difficulties, not being able to follow along. They keep losing their spot. And just as I've mentioned, the poor reading comprehension, because they are using all of their mental energy to decode, to get their eyes to do, or get their system to do what they're trying to do to decode. So there's no room left in their working memory and in their focus and attention to be able to then pay attention to what the meaning of the text is. So bottom line is it's a bottom-up approach with addressing the root cause of learning and reading difficulties as well as behavioral difficulties. We have to make sure that brain is well developed, that it's well organized, and that there are nice, strong connections before we start moving further up that learning pyramid and start addressing auditory and visual processing. And then we start getting into stuff like phonics and so forth. So let me know, do you see this with your child? Do you think they have poor vestibular function? Have you heard of space dyslexia? Does your child have sensory processing issues or poor motor control or coordination? That might be other clues of that. Let me know in the comments below whether you're watching the live or the replay. And I will put the link in the comments below to my free starter kit, the Laser Focused Learner. Thanks for watching, everybody.